Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with Better a Witty Fool, my series on a critique of presuppositionalism. In this one we are going to be looking at William James versus presuppositionalism. First off, I'm going to give you a little explanation of who William James was, a little bit about his life, and then we will go into what might have been an argument he would propose based on his philosophical position against presuppositionalism. Let's take a look. So, who was William James? Well, before knowing anything about him, he had some pretty famous relatives. His brother was Henry James, the author of Daisy Miller, Turn of the Screw, and Portrait of a Lady. His grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, who was an important advocate for the theory of evolution. His godfather was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an essayist and leader of the Transcendentalist movement, and his godson was William James Sidus, supposedly spoke 40 languages, wrote a book at age 8, entered Harvard at 11, and had one of the highest recorded ever IQs. If you knew nothing else, clearly you would know that William James is a pretty important person. However, he was also considered the father of American psychology, but spent some time in philosophy as well, and was one of the founders of Pragmatism. Now, what is pragmatism? Well, pragmatism contrasts absolute truth with pragmatic truth. Absolute truth are statements that in some way correspond to reality, whereas pragmatic truth are going to be statements that are useful to believe in some way. What does he mean by that? Well, let's look at some quotes. The true, to put it briefly, is only the expedient way of our thinking. Ideas become true just insofar as they help us get to satisfactory relations with other parts of our experience. And any idea that will carry us prosperously from any one part of our experience to any other part, linking things satisfactorily, working securely, saving labor, is true for just so much, true insofar forth, true instrumentally. Basically, what he's saying is, we don't need absolute truth. All we need is pragmatic truth. All we need are statements that are useful to believe. In fact, there's a famous story of James and Royce strolling down a road and sat down a wall in earnest discussion. When James heard the camera click as his daughter took a photograph, he cried, "Royce, you're being photographed! Look out, I say! Damn the absolute!" Showing his extreme distaste for absolute truth, or things being solidly set in certainty. He was all about whatever is useful to do, whatever is useful to believe. Now, it's important to note before we get to kind of a James-ish, or a Jamesian, or a pragmatic, rather, argument against the presuppositionalist, James himself was a theist and offered a number of arguments defending theism, but he did it from a pragmatic standpoint. He has the famous essay, The Will to Believe, which is in opposition to William Clifford, Ethics of Belief. We'll have to take a look at that argument in another video because it's a fascinating debate. Basically, he says God exists because the belief that God exists makes people happy or makes them have good relations with the world and so on and so forth. Bertrand Russell, of course, famously objected to this, saying that sure, well, Santa Claus exists because belief in him makes us happy. They'll go back and forth, but that's not really what we're focusing on. Today we're focusing on presuppositionalism. So, when faced with our original set of choices for whether or not absolute truth exists, James would go ahead and click the fourth one, saying, I don't care if absolute truth exists. And this wouldn't because he's off in some fantasy world. It would be because he would be caring about pragmatic truth as opposed to absolute truth. And then the presuppositionalist, of course, would refuse to have a discussion, even though James has put forward a very interesting and powerful philosophical position known as pragmatism. So, it's possible to not care if absolute truth exists and still sustain a philosophical point of view. So, to put it more formally, William James' objection would go something like this. Truth is not absolute, truth is pragmatic. Pragmatic truth is given by the consequences of believing the statement. What happens based on believing the statement? Are you happy? Do you have good relations with other parts of your life? And so on and so forth. Pragmatic truth does not require a higher power to underwrite it. While absolute truth might, whether or not that's true, we'll get into something later. Therefore, belief in pragmatic truth does not require God to underwrite it. It would seem that if you're a pragmatist, the presuppositionalist argument is not going to be even close to convincing to you. So, as a first way out, simply become a pragmatist. It's a very interesting position about truth. There's a lot of philosophers that aren't too happy about it, but it is a philosophical position that one can hold. That was William James versus Presuppositionalism. Next up is Pyrrho, Thomas Kuhn, Agrippa, Bertrand Russell, Saul Kripke, Quine and Goodman, Aristotle, Lewis Carroll, and Carneades. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.